Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation about horticulture. Today, I am going to be taking some more time to talk about plant diversity. We had a previous conversation where we talked about some of the major groups of plants. And this time we're going to narrow this down a little bit and start talking about some of the families of plants. And of course, I always have to start off. Sometimes I choose these backgrounds because I just like a particular painting. That's a painting by Claude Monet. I always enjoy the Impressionists' use of color, particularly when they're depicting plants. I just think those are fantastic. So if you like this initial picture, I do encourage you to go and look at some of the paintings by Monet and some of the other Impressionists. So we talked previously about some topics in plant taxonomy, and we really kept that up at the level of the class. Some really big groups of plants, and talked about some of the differences that we saw there. And those are very broad groups that just include a large number of plants. Within them, there's still a very large amount of diversity. And as we move down in the taxonomic structure, we are skipping over order a little bit there, just to get down to families, because I think that at that level, when we start talking about plant families, we really start getting into groups where we can really use that in terms of our own gardens and horticulturally as an interesting way to think about the use of plants in our landscape. So we're going to talk about some plant families today. There are, the last I checked, somewhere north of 260 different families of plants. So with that, we are certainly not going to even make a dent in that number and be able to talk about all of those different families. But I've picked out a few that either I think are interesting or that show up very frequently in home landscapes, and I think will be interesting to have a conversation about. So just to begin again, you can see where family is in that structure of the taxonomic tree, with kingdoms being the broad groups like plants and animals. And of course, we are very familiar with genus and species, so family is just right above that as the broader group. And I also want to take just a moment to talk about how plants are assigned to these taxonomic groups. Originally, when the taxonomic system was first designed, much of this was down to the morphology of the plant. And what I mean by morphology is the shape of the structures and the growth habit of the plant. So for example, if you look at the two pictures down in the bottom there, those are two flowers from the family Solanaceae. One of those is a tomato flower, one of them is a pepper flower. And you can see, looking at those flowers, that they have a lot of characteristics in common. The numbers of the petals are very similar. The structure of the flower is very much the same. Now, as we move into the future, we have already started to use the genetics of plants to tell us where those plants are going to be very closely related. So we can actually compare the genomes of the plants, look at how similar they are, and use that as a very effective method to learn what the evolutionary history of those plants are, and use that to group them into meaningful categories. So one thing that is important is that taxonomy is not a stable system. It's not something that was set in stone and that's what it is forever. We are constantly learning about the taxonomy of every kind of organism. We're constantly learning about their interrelationships and understanding them better. And as our understanding improves, we may see some changes in these taxonomic groups. In fact, I have excuse me, I have certainly seen that over the course of my career, where organisms that I worked with are reassigned to different groups, not because there's anything that changed about the organism, but because how we understand or how well we understand that organism has improved. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're just going to talk about a number of different families of plants, give a little bit of information about what structures and what those plants have in common. And then for a fair few of them, I'm going to pick a plant or two out of that group and talk a little bit more about it, just as a matter of interest, because there were just some really interesting plants out there. One plant that we are certainly going to be familiar with, or one group of plants we're going to be very familiar with, is the Asteraceae. I implore you, please don't get concerned about the nature of these Greek and Latin names. It is perfectly okay to call these composites or the daisy family. You don't have to be technical. I'm going to give you the fancy name. But if what you remember is the daisy family, that is perfectly all right. Now, most of these plants are going to be herbs. There are a few that are larger that might be bushes or trees. What's really significant in terms of the structure of these plants that really kind of groups them together is the way that their flowers are arranged. And so what you'll see is the flowers are actually many flowers all fused together into a larger flower head. The flowers themselves can actually be very, very small, but the flower head itself could be very large indeed. Sunflower would be a famous example of this. So each of those flowers sits on a fused receptacle at the base of that flower. All of that is covered over by bracts, and that really is sort of the core characteristic of this group of plants. And these plants are found all over the world in all sorts of different habitats, so wet areas, dry areas, alpine areas, so a very widely distributed group of plants. A lot of these are plants that, again, we're going to find in our gardens, and there are quite a few that are used commercially and as food plants. So lettuce would be a good example. Artichoke is another really good one, as is sunflower. Sunflower, of course, is significant because not only do we use it as an ornamental plant, but also as a food plant and an oil plant. So certainly a very broadly, a very broad use plant for the landscape and commercially. A lot of ornamentals that we treasure in this group. So all of the daisies and chrysanthemums, cosmos and marigolds fit into this group and do a fantastic job in the home landscape because of those large flower heads really make them stand out. One interesting plant in the Asteraceae is the pyrethrum daisy. It is a kind of daisy. You see it in the top picture right there. And it is significant as the source of a pesticide that we frequently use in our home landscapes. Pyrethrum and pyrethrin are right there together. Pyrethrin is derived from that plant. And you can see the chemical structure of that, which I include just for interest. But that is the source of the organic insecticide that we frequently use in our home landscapes. Another really large group of plants that has a lot of uses in the home landscape is the rose family, the Rosaceae. All sorts of really beautiful cultivated flowers, as well as fruiting species that we have in this group. We do find these naturally or natively, mainly in the northern temperate areas of the world. So right where we live and north of us. And there's a lot of diversity in the growth habits of these plants. A lot of them are trees, but also shrubs and climbers. Often they do have thorns. Of course, we can think of the rose plant with that, but We also have a lot of experience with some of our fruiting plants having thorns. Um, do tend to have flowers. If you look very closely at the flowers, they often are in multiples of five. So that's a good way that we can look at different plants and different groups of plants, is actually counting the number of flower petals, because there tends to be a lot of uniformity within families for how many actual petals there are on the flower. Of course, when the multiples get high, that can be really difficult to count out. Of course, within the Rosaceae, a lot of those are going to be the fruits we enjoy, like apples and peaches and cherries, even strawberries and almonds, all within this group. Of course, the roses are a really good example of an ornamental plant. One other use for this group of plants is to derive pectin that comes from apples, that we use in canning very frequently if we're making jams or jellies. That is generally going to be derived from apples. Rose oil is used for all sorts of things. And there are a few examples of African, things like African cherry, where there's some sort of medicinal use that is uh, tends to be folk medicine for the members of this family as well. Getting into another group that's really striking as a group for ornamentals, the Geraniaceae, so Pelargonium or Geranium family, mostly annual or perennial herbs and dwarf shrubs. A lot of these have alternate leaves. So in that, the leaves are you're going to have one leaf come off at a node, the next node, the leaf will come off on the opposite side. You'll also see those as a basal rosette, so a whorl of leaves down at the bottom of the plant. A lot of these are cultivated as ornamentals. A lot of them are popular container plants. They tend to be native to subtropical or temperate regions. And there are a lot of also essential oils that are used from these plants as perfumes or flavorings, some in the pharmaceutical industry. A very popular family is the citrus family, the Rosaceae. These tend to be tropical plants, mostly trees and shrubs. Leaves are alternate. If you're familiar with the flowers from common citrus trees, some other interesting plants that are members of the Rosaceae, so related to citrus. One I really, or two I really enjoy, is the curry leaf tree. It is, of course, a very important ingredient in Indian curries. This is a really interesting plant. There's a gentleman here in Hancock County who grows these for use in making curries, and they actually do pretty well so long as they get some cold protection, growing them in containers. Another one is the Sichuan or Szechuan pepper. It's used as a spice. Of course, when we think of peppers here in South Mississippi, we're generally going to be thinking about the traditional pepper, the Capsicum annuum, that's a member of the Solanaceae that we grow in our gardens. But Szechuan pepper is quite a bit different. Grows as a bush or a tree, and gives a lot of really great flavor to some Chinese and Southeast Asian foods. All right, another really important ornamental group are the Iridaceae, the gladioluses and irises. Perennial evergreen or deciduous herbs, really attractive, colorful flowers. All of these plants have corms or bulbs. So if you're familiar with planting corms and bulbs in the late winter or the late fall or the early spring, very likely you are interacting with members of the family Iridaceae. Natively, we tend to find these out in grasslands, though there are some that we'll see in forest margins. Leaves tend to be sword shaped. Sometimes they form fans, and they tend to show up when the flowers are showing up. And of course, really distinctive flowers. And we're very familiar with the irises down here in South Mississippi because, of course, the Louisiana iris grows very well here and is a plant that we can put in to tolerate wet conditions. An interesting member of this group is the spice saffron, and the spice saffron is the world's most expensive spice. You can see a picture up there in the top of a saffron flower, and the bit that is harvested is the stigma. So that's the red bit that you see there. In order to get 1 pound or 454 grams of dry saffron, you have to hand harvest between 50,000 and 75,000 of those flowers. So the reason why it's so expensive is because all of the labor that goes into producing it. And of course, a lot of irises that are involved in the cut flower industry. One group that I am very fond of are the Scrophulariaceae, which we're going to call, I'm just going to call them the Snapdragon family because pronouncing that even for me can tie out my tongue just a little bit. A lot of these are annual or perennial herbs. A lot of them have hairs that will actually secrete oils to attract pollinators to them. A lot of diversity in temperate areas, really common in open grasslands or high mountain areas. And they have some really interesting flower shapes. Of course, we're all familiar. Antirrhinum is the snapdragon, but we also have things like penstemon that we commonly use in the landscape. One of my favorite flowers, I think, is just extraordinarily attractive, is foxglove. The scientific name for foxglove is digitalis. And you can see the picture there of foxglove on the bottom. I just think it's an absolutely gorgeous flower. You have to be careful with it because it is a toxic plant. Digitalis does have some medicinal use for heart conditions and things like that. I'm not a medical doctor, so I always hesitate on things like that. But it just has an extraordinarily beautiful flower. And is kind of characteristic of the family in just the beauty of the flowers that you see. Another interesting group or interesting genus in this family is the genus Diascia. And the genus has actually evolved specifically with one genus of bees, the Rediviva bees. And they are very specific for pollination by these particular bees. And generally one species or a narrow number of species of bees are capable of pollinating those flowers. And the leg shape of the bees, or in the leg length of the bees, will match the length of the spurs for different Diascia species, just to really kind of hone in that only those bees can pollinate those flowers. So it's a really interesting example of where two groups of organisms have evolved together to cooperate. Interesting group of plants, Crassulaceae. Most of these are succulents, herbs and small shrubs. You tend to find them in rocky habitats. They are found all over the world, but they tend to be found in dry areas like Mexico and South Africa. Leaves tend to be spirally arranged or opposite. Some really good example of those. Kalanchoa is really common. Of course, a mother of thousands up there in the top is another really common one that works well as an ornamental and that people keep as a houseplant. One interesting thing about the Crassulaceae, it is from them we get the term crassulacean acid metabolism. What this is a modification of the process of photosynthesis for the plants. So if you vaguely remember photosynthesis and the methods of that, how that works. You know that there's a light cycle and a dark cycle, or what we call a light cycle and a dark cycle in photosynthesis, though it's not really true that one happens during the day and one happens at night. It's just one requires light and one doesn't. One of the problems with photosynthesis is that it requires the plant to open up the holes, the stomata on the leaf, in order to take in carbon dioxide and emit oxygen and water. If you're a plant and you're located in an area where it's very dry, potentially very hot, doing that during the day is very risky for you because you can lose way too much water. So without getting too much into the mechanisms of it, crassulacean acid metabolism is a modification of photosynthesis where the stomates tend to open at night. They go through part of the process. Some of the products of that are stored in part of the structure of the plant cell. And then when it gets to daytime, it can close those stomates, those holes, those stomates in the leaves, and then go through the other side of the photosynthesis process that requires light. And that helps the plant survive in areas with very arid conditions, very hot conditions. Now, Crassulaceae are not the only plants that do this. Cactuses, in some cases, orchids, agaves, pineapples, sedum, even Spanish moss is able to use this mechanism of photosynthesis, but it's from the name of the family that we get this name. A common plant family that you're very likely to know from your garden are the Lamiaceae, also called the mint family. A lot of these are annual or perennial herbs. There are even some large trees and woody climbers. Tend to be found just about every habitat, all the way from tropical forests to the Arctic tundra. Um, Very frequently, an easy way to tell members of the mint family is that they have square stems. Um, and you can see one really common one we have down here in the south is henbane, or henbit rather. And you can see that very frequently in your yards, particularly warm periods of time during the winter. Where we really know Lamiaceae or the mint family from are a lot of our culinary herbs, like mint, sage, thyme, lavender, basil, all very important herbs that we use in cooking and work fantastically in the home landscape as parts of our gardens. An interesting other member of the mint family is if you've heard of teak wood. Teak is a tree and is very important as a timber hardwood. There was a while there where harvesting wild teak plants was actually a danger to the conservation of that tree. They do have plantations of teak now. But one of the things that's really characteristic of this family is they have those oils, that great flavor that we get from the herbs, that great smell of mint. Those are oils that are produced by the plant. Teak wood has a lot of those oils in it, and it makes it very resistant to insects and rot. And so it makes it very effective and very useful as a form of timber. Another one we're going to be really familiar with is the Brassicaceae. I always call them the Brassicas, but the mustard family. A lot of herbaceous plants. Cruciform flowers just means you have the four petals that are kind of spread out evenly. Mostly found natively in the northern hemisphere. Really easy to tell, though I don't generally recommend tasting plants to help you identify them. The leaves do have a very distinctive taste to them, and you often see the plants growing with a basal rosette of leaves. A lot of really important crop plants like broccoli and cabbage and turnips. A lot of oils that are made from these. Of course, canola oil is made from the raffinus plant. Also, canola oil and rapeseed oil are the same thing. Sometimes there's a difference in terminology where we refer to canola oil for cooking, rapeseed oil for other uses, but really they're pretty much the same thing. A really common garden ornamental that we might see from this family is nasturtium, also called 4 o'clocks. You can see them in the bottom there. And interestingly, the nasturtium flowers are edible. You can put them in your salad. I had a really wise horticulturist tell me that the first thing we eat with is our eyes. And so adding some of that bright color to our salads is a great way to kind of improve the experience. Though when I tasted them, I wasn't, to be honest, particularly thrilled. Interesting member of the Brassicaceae is Brassica oleracea, or wild mustard. And what's really interesting about it is how it's been used and selectively bred over many, many years to produce so many different crops. So cauliflower, broccoli, kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all the same species of plant that has been selectively bred for different for different parts of the plant. So if we selected it for flower clusters, we could get cauliflower. We wanted lateral buds, we could get Brussels sprouts. If we wanted leaves, we can get kale. Over many, many generations of breeding the plant to have it show those different qualities. The Ranunculaceae, or the buttercups, most of these are herbs, but there are some shrubs and vines that are in here. A lot of ornamental plants like anemone and buttercups and clematis. Some of those are used as herbs, and particularly for herbal medicine. Again, no recommendations here. There's really no scientific support behind the use of golden seal for various purposes, but it is a common herb. In fact, up in the top there, that is a picture of golden seal, the plant, which is actually, there was again a while there, while so many people were harvesting it because it was primarily sourced from wild harvesting, that it was damaging to the conservation of that species. Another interesting species in the Ranunculaceae is aconitum, or called monkshood or wolfsbane. And aconitum is primarily interesting because it is both a very attractive plant with those really striking blue flowers that you see there in that middle picture. But it also has a long history of being used as a poison. The story behind it being called wolfsbane is that they would treat arrows with aconitum to get rid of wolves. I certainly don't encourage that, but there are several other stories of aconite or aconitum poisoning from its use in the garden. But very attractive plant. Just make sure you know not to chew on it. Very important plant, and one that I am very attracted to, one that I'm very grateful to because I've done a fair bit of work with it, are the Solanaceae. These are the nightshade families, though I tend to think of it as the tomato family. A lot of herbs and shrubs, but some small trees tend to have a very strong scent when they're crushed. Very distinct. If you've ever crushed a tomato vine or tomato branch, you know they do have a very strong odor to them. Very distinctive flowers. There are a lot of vegetables from the Solanaceae, including tomatoes and potatoes and peppers and eggplant, which many of us have in our home vegetable gardens. The top picture there is one that I really like to include. That is a native Peruvian tomato before many, many, many years of selective breeding to produce our modern tomatoes. We also have medicinal or toxic plants like nightshade and mandrake. Nightshade, often or sometimes called belladonna, it was used to dilate what some people believe, or it's hard to confirm, that was used to dilate the eyes of people to make them appear more attractive. Certainly wouldn't encourage that, though again there is some medicinal use there if it's used as part of good treatment. So that was not a picture to answer. That was not a picture of a morning glory. Morning glory is in a different group, and we'll get to them. But there are some ornamentals in here, including angels, trumpets, and petunias, calibrachoa, and some damaging plants in here, like nicotiana or tobacco plants. So a really interesting group with a lot of interesting characteristics. The Fabaceae are another really important group. This is the third largest flowering plant family. Probably the easiest distinctive feature is the pods that they produce. So you can think of bean pods or pea pods. Most of these are herbs and shrubs, but there's just a wide diversity in this family. They're found all over the place. And there are all sorts of food crops from peas and beans. I had an interesting experience recently with tamarind. I had not ever had fresh tamarind. I encourage you to give that a try because it was actually really tasty. And you can make kind of a tea out of it that is a really refreshing drink. There are also some ornamental plants in the Fabaceae, like hyacinth bean, scarlet runner bean, wisteria, though I caution you on wisteria that if you do establish it in an area, you may never be able to get rid of it. One interesting feature of the Fabaceae is that they have an association with their roots with a kind of bacterium called rhizobium. If you look in the picture there at the top, you see those little nodules on the roots, and those nodules have the bacterium in them. So those bacterium allow the plants to do what we call fixed nitrogen. So the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is generally bound to another nitrogen, and it's very unreactive. So nothing can really use it. Those bacteria are able to break that nitrogen apart and put it into a form that plants can use. So they convert it over into another form of nitrogen, bound to other things besides another nitrogen, and that allows the plants to use them. So these plants, like clover, cowpeas, and other members of the legumes or pea plants, Fabaceae, if you will, can be used as cover crops and are frequently used as cover crops because they can increase, if you till them in, you can increase the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil. Cucurbitaceae, the cucumber family, I will often call these the cucurbids. A lot of annual and perennial climbers found all over the place in woodlands and savannas and deserts. Mostly herbs with trailing stems and creep across the ground or climb up surfaces. The flowers of these groups plants tend to be unisexual, so either male or female, which if any of you have ever seen the first flowers come on your squash plants and wondered why they don't turn into squash, you have to look down and see if there's a swelling at the base of that flower, which would indicate that it's a female flower. You have to have a male and female flower, and of course the fruit only come from those female flowers. Cucurbids have been used for a wide variety of purposes over the years. Of course, we have all of the vegetable crops like cucumbers and pumpkins and zucchinis and melons. We've also used cucurbit gourds as containers. I've grown a few of those and thought it was really interesting as something to do in the garden. There is the loofah gourd, which when you take it apart, of course, that's where you get a natural loofah from. Another interesting one is the tsama, and please don't hold me to that pronunciation, which is a melon that grows in the Namib Desert in Africa, which is not only an important source of food, but also a really important source for water for animals in that area. Of course, it's a very dry area, and there's going to be a lot of water that's stored in that melon. The Amaryllidaceae, or the Clivia or Amaryllis family, widely cultivated, a lot of herbaceous perennial bulb plants. The flowers are borne on a leafless stalk, tend to be arranged in clusters. and a lot of these are adapted to dry habitats. A lot of these are very important in the flower industry, like crinum lilies and amaryllis and daffodils. But there's also some really important culinary ones. So the allium, so garlic and onion. Do want to pay attention. Some of these bulbs are going to be toxic to pets like cats and dogs, where if they eat them, they can get digestive problems. So you certainly enjoy them, but keep them away from your pets. Probably the most significant family in terms of agriculture, Poaceae, are the grasses, annual and perennial herbs, usually tufted, reproduce with rhizomes. Very rarely are they woody or tree-like, and principally when I'm talking about that, what I'm talking about is bamboo. They grow, very broad groups. So some of them grow in very wet conditions. Some of them tolerate very dry conditions. Um, and the leaves tend, of course, they're blades. They are monocots. Tend to have their flowers at the top of the culms or the stalks, where the flowers are borne in spikelets. Really important food crops like barley, corn, rice, and wheat, sugar cane. Also important as ornamentals, so muhly grass and bamboo, pampas grass, pennisteum. All of these are important ornamentals, but also used as textiles. So I have a set of sheets that are made from bamboo. Some of them are used as building materials, not so you can see bamboo flooring and things like that, or materials made that way. Another significant use is as biofuels. So some of these plants are grown, and the starch in the plants is converted over to ethanol and can be used as a fuel. So an extraordinarily significant family of plants. One thing that is I'm going to use the Poaceae as an example of this, though again, this is not restricted just to this group of plants. So you see this in some other groups as well, is another modification of photosynthesis, and we call this C4 photosynthesis. And I'm not going to, again, not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the things that a lot of plants are challenged with are high temperatures and dry conditions. Particularly high temperatures can be an issue, because higher the temperature gets, there's an interaction that happens with carbon dioxide and oxygen in the process of photosynthesis that can be really costly to the plant in terms of energy. So the plant wants to be able to make sure that carbon dioxide driven process works easily and isn't interrupted when the temperature gets high. And so in order to do this, they start off the process of photosynthesis and then send those materials to what are called the bundle sheath cells. Those surround the vascular tissue in the plant. And then it goes through the second step of photosynthesis there. And that just defends the plant and allows it to grow really well in conditions that are very hot. And so in some cases, that's a benefit for us. We really do like our sugar cane and our sorghum and other plants like that to be able to grow in high temperature conditions. In some cases, like crabgrass or pigweed, that's less of a benefit. We would probably prefer them not to be able to grow so actively. The Apiaceae are also called the carrot family, really diverse in temperate parts of the world, particularly in the northern hemisphere. Most of them are herbaceous annuals. Many have basal rosettes, again, so a bunch of leaves all gathered together down at the bottom of the plant, found in all sorts of different environments. Tend to have leaves that are finely divided. So you can think about carrot leaves or dill leaves. Parsley and coriander are also in this group, so you do have some of your herbs there. You can think of those really kind of thread-like leaves. Also do see some flowers in this group, though not ones that I tend to run into very often here. Malvaceae is a really important family, not only ornamentally, but in agriculture. It is the Hibiscus family. Of course, we know it for the absolutely gorgeous flowers that we see on these plants. Most of these are herbs or shrubs. A lot of them have star-shaped hairs. Find them in tropical and subtropical areas, in savannas and forest edges. So some really good examples of Malvaceae. First of all, of course, is the very important crop cotton. Of course, Mississippi has a thriving cotton industry, and that is a very important crop here. And I'm always struck, cotton fields when they have their flowers blooming are just absolutely gorgeous. Of course, we also have hibiscus in our home landscapes, and of course okra in our home gardens. And I think I might like my okra plants more for their flowers than I do for the okra themselves. To pick out an interesting member of this family, there is the marshmallow. And of course, mallows are a plant that we may sometimes use in our gardens. But marshmallow is where we get the term marshmallow that we might go buy at the grocery store. The scientific name right there, it's Althea officinalis. And so the original marshmallow is actually made using powdered marshmallow root as a binder. There's the French name, pâté de, I don't speak French, um, but the marshmallow was basically pounded and dried out and used as a powder and used as a binder. Now, it's much easier to use gelatin for this, and it was used, gelatin was sort of kind of replaced the actual marshmallow root. But if you can come upon it, and you can actually purchase marshmallow root powder as an interesting exercise in the kitchen, you can use that to make marshmallows at home. And I can tell you they are actually quite good. Another really important family are the Amaranthaceae, or the amaranth family, mostly subtropical and tropical plants, annual and perennial herbs. A lot of them grow in sandy areas or disturbed areas. And the flowers are really distinctive, small flowers that are in spike-like structures. So there is the food crop amaranth, which is a really important grain, very productive grain. Of course, the ornamental that we grow here in our landscapes is Solanaceae, which we enjoy because it has those just fantastic spikes that it puts up, and it lasts for a really long time out in the landscape. As a damaging plant, there is pigweed, which is a serious problem in agricultural fields as a weed that we have in soybean production and cotton production and other things like that. The Ericaceae, or the Erica family, or the heath family, a bunch of evergreen and deciduous shrubs, usually in seasonally dry places with really acidic soil. We do have some of these here. Of course, the rhododendrons and azaleas both fit into this group, as do the blueberries. So certainly some things that you would be very likely to find in the home landscape. Someone asked about morning glory. We'd find morning glory in the family Convolvulaceae, morning glory family. Really conspicuous flowers are called morning glories because they tend to show up in the morning and fade in the heat of the day. Most of them are shrubs or herbs, but a lot of them are vining. And in one example is a leafless parasitic plant. Tend to be found anywhere in temperate and tropical regions of the world. A lot of them have a milky latex when you cut the plant, and the flowers have a really distinctive kind of trumpet shape to them. Now, I mentioned that one of the morning glories, is a parasitic plant, and that is dodder. Dodder is a interesting plant. It does not actually photosynthesize itself. It is just a kind of a thin thread-like plant. You don't see leaves on it, and it grows up around other plants. And you can see several. You can see two pictures of that with the vines of that dodder wrapping around other plants. What it does then is it inserts a little probe that we're going to call a hostorium into the other plant and will actually absorb nutrients from it. One example of taxonomy changing over time is up until fairly recently. Daughter was in its own group, the Cuscutaceae, and it has been grouped in with the morning glories because of similarities that it has to those plants. Very popular plants, the Orchidaceae. I'm just going to say Convolvulaceae once to redeem myself now that I've taken a little sip of a drink there. But with the Orchidaceae, there is of course, the orchid families. It is the largest family of plants, and it's certainly not one that we would think of immediately if we thought of a group of plants where there are just tons and tons and tons of different species. But there is a great deal of specialization in the orchids. They tend to be adapted to a specialized insect pollination. So maybe only one species of insect is capable of pollinating that species of orchids. They are distributed all over the world from the tropics up to the subarctic, have diverse areas they can live in. Some of them are terrestrial, they grow on the ground. Some of them are epiphytes that will grow up off the ground and be air plants where they have no connection to the soil. Most of them tend to be perennial herbs and have tuberous roots, rhizomes, corms, and of course, are really popular as ornamentals. We do have some native orchids here in Mississippi. There's about 50 orchid species that are native. 30 of these grow south of Hattiesburg, and about 20 of them down here in the coastal counties. Most of those are terrestrial, so they grow right up out of the ground. The only native epiphyte, the one is the one you see there, which is the green fly orchid. And it is the only native epiphyte in the United States north of Florida. And you'll find it growing along rivers and lakes, areas of really high humidity. Most of our other native orchids are found in bogs and other wet areas. And one thing that can kind of be frustrating about orchids is they can stay dormant for years. And so we don't really see them. And then when the conditions are favorable for their growth, there they come. One orchid I'm really fond of is this one. This is Vanilla planiflora, or the vanilla plant. It is the world's second most valuable spice after saffron. It is an orchid. It grows up in a vine. Often it is grown against other trees. The one on the bottom there that you see is actually growing on an avocado tree, and they call those tutor trees because they provide shade and support for the plant. And then, of course, they're hand pollinated and hand harvested, and then they have to be dried and processed so that you can get your vanilla beans. But vanilla is also not only the second most valuable spice, but also the world's most popular flavor. So a really important member of the family. Another really important plant, our group of plants, are the Fagaceae, the oaks or beeches. Most of these are going to be large deciduous trees, have simple or alternate leaves. There are nuts that are produced, of course, the acorns and chestnuts. Very important as hardwood lumber that's used in the building of many, many houses and other structures. One interesting member of this family is the American chestnut. And you can see a historic picture of an American chestnut up there in the top, which is a site that I have never seen because the American chestnut was not there when I was growing up. It was already gone. There was a fungus that was introduced into the United States. We call it the resulting disease chestnut blight, and that resulted in the decline and death of all of those American chestnut trees. And they were very large trees, fast growing, and so they were really what we call a keystone species in American forests. And so the decline of the American chestnut was a very big deal. They're commonly used in urban environments because of their good ornamental features. Commonly used in lumber, and of course, people enjoyed the chestnuts as well. There have been of course, the American chestnut isn't gone, but what has happened is that essentially the trees died back, but the stumps remain in the ground, and they will send up new shoots. That's what you see in the picture on the far right there. But unfortunately, then that pathogen comes along once before they get very big, and it kills them down again. But they're still, you can see they're still trying. There have been quite a few attempts to bring back the American chestnut. A lot of that has been an attempt to hybridize American chestnuts with other species in the same group in order to provide resistance to that pathogen. So the Chinese chestnut is resistant to the pathogen, but so we breed that with American chestnut, and then we breed it with more and more American chestnut to make it as much an American chestnut as possible, but retain that resistance. And that is very difficult to do, very complicated breeding. In the very recent past, there has been developed a American chestnut that is genetically engineered to have a trait from wheat that provides it resistance to that pathogen. And essentially, it's an American chestnut with that gene inserted. And the debate on its release out into the wild to restore the American chestnut is still going on. I believe, of course, that when those are properly evaluated, I think it would be wonderful to see those trees come back into our landscapes and out and back into our forests. Another important group of plants are the Rubiaceae, the Gardenia family, the fourth largest family in the world. Most of these are tropical and subtropical, though there are a few species in cooler areas, mostly small trees and shrubs found in all sorts of different environments. Some really important members of this group, of course, absolutely critical for me, coffee is a member of this group. You can see a picture of the coffee berries up there in the top left. It's also where we get some very important ornamental plants, the gardenias, and some dyes. So madder, which is the red roots that you see there, and gambier, which are the white, which are again red berries. Excuse me. Up there are dyes that are used for clothing and other things. Probably the most, or certainly maybe tied for coffee as the most significant member of this family is quinine. So quinine is a prophylactic treatment or preventative treatment for malaria, which, of course, malaria is an extraordinarily dangerous disease that has had extraordinarily significant impacts on human history. But they discovered that the extract quinine, which comes from a tree, was able to help prevent you from getting malaria. And so they would treat people with quinine. Quinine has a very bitter taste. And so they would mix quinine with gin and some lime. And so we also have the effect of creating the gin and tonic as a extension of the use of quinine for malaria. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Again, in a presentation like this, it's not possible to do more than kind of give a quick overview of some interesting plant families or significant plant families. I hope to come back in the very near future. And while I've certainly picked out some here that are maybe the more common ones that we run into, what I'd like to do is come back to this topic, pick out some families that are possibly maybe the stranger or outliers, things like the carnivorous plants, which just have interesting life habits, and just try to describe a little bit more about the diversity of plants that are out there. So thank you very much. If you are watching on YouTube and you made it to the end, I congratulate you. If you do have any questions and you are watching on YouTube, you can put those down in the comment section. I'll be very happy to answer them. Also ask that you hit the subscribe button so you can find out when we have new videos that are coming out. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. And if you're listening here,